All right. Good afternoon. It's 12 o'clock on Wednesday. That means it's time for an Iowa Learning Farms conservation webinar. I hope everyone is doing well and in a place that's safe. And if you're in Iowa and maybe getting some ice here in the next few hours, um, today we're super excited to have Justin Meissen. Justin is the research program manager with the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. Justin's going to talk to us today about expanding the value of ag conservation programs for monarch butterfly recovery in Iowa. For anybody, probably most everybody on knows about the Tallgrass Prairie Center, but if you don't, I would encourage you all to go to their website and take a look. They just wonderful resources that have been working for so many years on understanding tallgrass prairie and restoration and establishment. Uh, Things that Justin knows a tremendous amount about, and I know very little about. So we're going to turn it over to Justin, who you came to hear from today, not me. So with that, uh, turn it over to you, Justin. If folks have questions, please type those in the chat box, and we'll get those to Justin at the end of the talk. With that, Justin, the virtual floor is all yours.
Right. Very good. Thank you, Matt. Thanks for that introduction. So today I'll be talking about how some very important conservation lands that we have across the Corn Belt, especially here in Iowa, plantings that are part of the USDA's Conservation Reserve Program, are functioning in the context of monarch butterfly conservation and how we might be able to expand the value of that program for monarchs. So to start off here, I'd like to give a brief introduction to the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We're an organization based out of the University of Northern Iowa, and our mission is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. The center was born out of Iowa's native roadside vegetation management program back in the 90s, and since then it's kind of grown in scope to multiple programs. I manage the research program where we focus on moving prairie restoration forward with applied science. Other programs include the Plant Materials Program, which is focused on getting source identified native seeds on the market. And we have our Iowa Roadside Management Program, where we support managing native vegetation and roadsides across the state. And finally, we have our Prairie on Farms program, where the objective is to integrate prairie into agricultural landscapes. And today, we'll be talking about research which is related to some of the aims of that. As I think most all of us are aware, the eastern migratory population of the monarch butterfly has been declining since the mid 2000s. The monarch, which breeds in the Midwest and eastern US during the summer, migrates south to Mexico in the fall and then overwinters in these huge colonies in the montane fir forests of Mexico. And that's where researchers can measure population sizes using the area of the colonies. As we can see here, the population size is at a nearly all-time low in 2024. And the best research currently pins the responsibility, at least in part, due to habitat loss in the upper Midwest, which is its primary breeding grounds and central migratory path. There's more emerging research also suggesting that other stressors like climate change driven weather events during migration and insecticide exposure are also playing some role in the decline. So this alarming decline has spurred a lot of concern, naturally, to where recently the monarch was recommended to be listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act last December. So with a listed monarch, it's a wide-ranging habitat generalist, and so the impacts to the way we manage land are going to be pretty significant. Most aspects of land management, whether it's pesticide use, mowing, haying, burn timing, or even how we use land in general, it's going to have to be evaluated to make sure that the Endangered Species Act is followed. And so, recovering monarch populations to safe levels is going to be essential to getting it delisted. You might be asking yourself, why am I, a restoration ecologist from the Tallgrass Prairie Center, talking to you about the monarch today? Well, in many ways, the monarchs are a tallgrass prairie butterfly. It's impacted by the loss of their primary breeding habitat. We all know about the dependence on milkweed for their larval stage, but the adults also need access to an abundance of nectar plants, which is to say wildflowers. So, ideal monarch habitat has both high milkweed density and high nectar density, which describes tallgrass prairies quite well. And this map gives us a general outline of where the important parts of the country are for monarch habitat. Yellow are the areas where the most overwintering monarchs are produced. So almost 40% of the individuals that end up in Mexico come from the Midwestern core area. And that area generally coincides with the historic extent of tallgrass prairie, which makes sense since milkweeds and nectar plants abound in the diverse grasslands that once covered the Midwest. So, monarch habitat restoration really can be fairly synonymous with tallgrass prairie restoration. If we look at some more concrete data, we can see how tallgrass prairies are pretty exceptional monarch habitat. Prairie remnants, the tallgrass prairies that have never been converted to agriculture, they host nearly 10,000 milkweed stems per hectare and of many different milkweed species. So that's almost 5 times better than our best attempts at prairie reconstruction. Um, and certainly the nectar plant differences are probably even more pronounced than that. So again, tallgrass prairie is a good model if we're aiming for monarch habitat. So with the potential listing here looming on the horizon, a coordinated effort began back in around 2018 that sought to identify some goals for monarch conservation across the key monarch states of the US. So, in concert with the Mid America Monarch Conservation Strategy, most states developed their own plan for monarch conservation, usually focusing on sort of a pathway to establishing new milkweed stems and habitat across a variety of sectors. And then typically states were breaking out agriculture, natural lands, rights of way, and urban sectors for goal setting. Um, Again, let's highlight the importance of this yellow region for monarch breeding habitat. Um, we're really looking then at a few states that are going to be really important in this whole effort. So specifically, we're talking about Corn Belt states, and Iowa in particular is going to be kind of the core of the core for monarch recovery. And each state plan has identified goals of establishing somewhere between 125 to 175 million new stems, milkweed stems, and associated nectar plants by 2038. But we have to ask the question: what's the plan to actually get these stems on the landscape? So I'll focus in on the Iowa plan from here on out. Now, the Iowa Monarch Conservation Strategy sets forth some basics about how these conservation activities are going to be achieved. Um, they are to be purposeful, coordinated, and voluntary conservation measures based on the best available scientific information. And then ultimately, the implementation of the Iowa strategy is supposed to contribute to the long-term conservation of monarch butterfly while also maintaining agricultural productivity. So all of this new habitat is to fit within the landscape without taking crops out of production. So let's take a look at where new monarch habitat is going to come from. So Iowa's land use, of course, is overwhelmingly dominated by agriculture, and so too is the expected contribution to new monarch habitat. In fact, the large majority of new milkweed stems are to be planted on ag acres. But if that's not coming from land taken out of crop production, where is it going to come from? Well, it is coming from existing conservation lands. So about 80% of those stems in the ag sector are planned to come from existing habitat in the form of improvements to what's already here. We can see some small amounts in marginal land conversions, pasture, but augmenting existing conservation land and specifically land in the Conservation Reserve Program or CRP, that's the huge driver here. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about CRP, define the terms a little bit. I'll say up front that I'm going to be oversimplifying things when I talk about CRP and how it works. It's very complex program that aims to achieve sort of all kinds of conservation goals across the U.S., wetlands to forests, prairies. I'm happy to dive into details in the Q&A. But the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, is a USDA administered program that's extremely widespread in the Corn Belt, especially. If we're only talking about prairie-like practices, which is to say ones that focus on native grassland vegetation, the ones most relevant to monarch habitat, there's over 2 million acres out there in the upper Midwest alone. And these practices take the form of 10 to 15-year contracts with the USDA, where landowners get a rental payment to revegetate former crop ground and manage it for conservation objectives. Now, the program has changed a lot in the past 3 or so decades. Historically, implementation of CRP has been quite simple with respect to the kind of plants that have been used for revegetation. Using more than a handful of species, let alone native species, wasn't very common in the past. But more recently, we've seen these programs take on more complex issues with aspects of ecosystem rehabilitation included in their targets. So, more and more of the revegetation projects being deployed are now requiring diverse native vegetation, and the most significant ones of those being habitat, wildlife habitat, and pollinator related. So here's an area chart of what states are most important when it comes to CRP. We have each upper Midwest state's contribution on the y-axis and then time on the x. You can see that the Corn Belt drives these acres, with Iowa by itself making up nearly half of these prairie-like acres in the upper Midwest. And as you can see here, altogether, these practices comprise about 2 million acres. Okay, so now that we have some background on what we're talking about when we're talking about CRP, let's return to the Iowa Monarch Conservation Strategy. So within existing CRP acres in Iowa, the plan is to establish about 40 million new stems. So that means that we're putting a lot of eggs into this one basket. So if we're using the low estimates, improving existing CRP is planned to create almost a third of all new milkweed stems in Iowa for monarch recovery. And this also assumes that federal funding and support for the programs are maintained at or above fiscal 2017. So this also means that folks with CRP and other kinds of conservation ag land have a huge opportunity here to make a contribution to monarch recovery. The charge is pretty clear, right? Landowners will need to enhance their CRP to increase milkweed and nectar plants on the landscape. But how can we make sure that they succeed at monarch recovery efforts and that efforts are useful? So, given the immense importance of this strategy to enhance existing CRP, we at the Tallgrass Prairie Center and the Farm Service Agency wanted to look into how well this might be achieved. So, through a cooperative research agreement with the Farm Service Agency, we just wrapped up, we asked a few questions surrounding CRP and monarchs. One, we wanted to know how much monarch habitat does typical CRP currently support? Two, is enhancing existing CRP warranted? And three, how well does enhancement work? So, in service of answering these questions, we had these objectives across a series of studies we conducted over the past few years. So this will serve as the roadmap going forward for the rest of the talk as we walk through each study. Um, Unfortunately, I've had to cut the discussion of a lot of our other studies within this project for time, but I'd encourage you to check out the whole report that's posted on our website in the research publications part of our website to read the whole story here. So our first objective was to estimate baseline monarch habitat value of common CRP practices. We used an observational study for that. And then our second objective was to assess approved methods for enhancing CRP. And we specifically will be talking about a field experiment today. All right, so let's talk about our first objective, estimating baseline monarch habitat in common CRP practices. Okay, well, I think we've established here that CRP is a pretty big deal in terms of monarch habitat. Um, we don't really have a great handle on what kind of vegetation these CRP plantings are providing. Um, there are some very coarse estimates out there, and when we talk about milkweed stems for monarch recovery, the only study that looked at CRP as a specific land use is almost 25 years old. We know the program has changed dramatically since then, and so we needed to look at some more modern practices. And so we did an observational study throughout eastern Iowa to characterize monarch habitat provision in typical CRP that will be tapped for monarch enhancement. So to get at our objectives, we looked at expiring CP25 plantings in eastern Iowa. So CP25, or rare and declining habitat, is an extremely common conservation practice in the upper Midwest that's well suited for monarch habitat enhancement. It's a native grassland practice that basically seeks to mimic a prairie reconstruction. So we collaborated with FSA and NRCS staff and sent emails and letters to several hundred CRP landowners, 10 counties within 70 miles of Cedar Falls. And of those initial contacts, we found about 17 sites that met the necessary criteria. All of these sites were enrolled in the CP25 practice for 10 to 15 years. So site age here was more or less constant across the study. And then on average, the sites were about 32 acres, though it did vary quite a bit. Now we weren't able to record seed mixes at all the sites, but when landowners did have seed mix records, they were generally Pheasants Forever CP25 mixes. So these are affordable, moderately diverse mixes, and they tend toward about 30 or so native species with heavy reliance on the native grasses and a few common forbs. So at each site, we measured plant composition in 100 meter square quadrats along a series of randomly placed transects at each site. So we used a bit of a modified nested quadrat method similar to the integrated monarch monitoring program. But we did want to capture a more complete picture of plant composition at sites. So we measured the presence of all species rather than just flowering forbs. So we still counted milkweed stems, but we also measured canopy cover classes of all species at every other full quadrat. So let's take a look at what we found. So we'll take a look at nectar plants and overall plant community composition first. The dominant vegetation cover, 57% relative cover, was grass. And depending on the site, that was either native warm season or non-native cool season grass. And then following that, fall and summer nectar plants were quite well represented in the plant community. The interesting thing about the nectar plants, though, is that only a small percent were likely seeded. That is to say, purposeful. So most of the nectar plants were what you might call ruderal natives, especially tall goldenrod, which is the most abundant overall. So these are plants that are kind of uh, quote unquote at large in the landscape, and they're pretty commonly able to recolonize a lot of sites. Um, on the other hand, seeded nectar plants, or things that we assume would have been seeded, made up about 10% of the vegetation. And those were common native plants like wild bergamot and gray-headed coneflower. Then let's take a look at milkweed stems. So we found that milkweed stem density, at least in these CRP plantings, was quite high, higher than expected based on previous estimates. We found that the mean stem density of all milkweed species, which in our case was mostly common milkweed and world milkweed, to be 2,500 stems plus or minus 592 per hectare. The vast majority, again, were common milkweed. Um, Now, other studies tend to report median values as well, which tend to be considerably smaller than the mean. And in our study, we found median milkweed density about 1,800 stems per hectare. So, in context with other studies, our results fit pretty well alongside estimates of prairie reconstructions and other conservation grasslands in the Midwest. Our estimates are a bit higher than general conservation grasslands, but a bit lower than high diversity plantings in Nebraska and Iowa roadside prairie plantings. Um, One thing is for sure, though, our estimates are considerably higher than the ones being used in models to estimate habitat needs for monarch recovery, where those studies, which were done in the early 2000s, estimated CRP at about 5 to 600 stems per acre. Our estimates are about 3 to 4 times higher. Another thing to note, CP42, which is a different practice than what we looked at, um, is extremely good for monarchs. So while we're talking about the importance of CP25 today, I just want to note how important those pollinator plantings are when we're talking about CRP as well. And that one is, you can see that on the far right of the graph. Okay, so takeaways from this study. Um, Many of these prairie-like CRP plantings are already providing quite a bit of high-quality monarch habitat. Um, Interestingly, though, most of those plants, those nectar plants, and almost all the milkweeds, probably established naturally, so they weren't purposeful. So we kind of got lucky here. Um, those those sites are also dominated by grasses, so orb enhancement very well may be quite feasible. Okay, so let's move on to our next objective, assessing approved methods for enhancing CRP. So, with the strategy of improving existing CRP for monarch habitat, upgrading low quality CRP to higher quality CRP by seeding milkweed and nectar plants is the primary method. So it's pretty typical for older plantings to revert to cool season grass dominance, or for there to be lands and older practices that were, actually planted to cool season grasses, like a CP1. Um, Unlike new CRP plantings that are coming out of crop production, establishing native forbs in stands like these require some degree of disturbance. Um, Especially now that the monarch is recommended for listing, there's probably going to be a push to get things planted quickly to show that progress is being made. And some might even push to just get the seed on the ground and skip site prep altogether. Um, so to see what's actually effective here, we evaluated site preparation methods, specifically herbicide frequency, to increase monarch habitat in cool season grasslands. So we established a field experiment in an old hay strip in eastern Iowa to look at how intense site prep needs to be in order to establish monarch habitat. So we applied glyphosate with a surfactant to the existing vegetation, either once in early May or twice, where we sprayed in early May and late May. And then we also had unsprayed plots, which were left untouched. Um, so after site prep or lack thereof, we then seeded a diverse prairie seed mix with milkweeds, forbs, and grasses in each plot with a no-till native seed drill in early June. Seeding rates were comparable to pollinator mixes, especially for milkweeds. Um, and then we followed up in late summer for 3 years, measuring milkweed and sown species stem density and canopy cover for all species. So let's take a look at what happened. So first, we're going to look at how the different plant groups responded. So on each graph here, we have time on the x-axis and relative cover on the y. Um, so there's two key findings here. Native species established best with site prep consisting of 2 herbicide applications. And also, cool season grasses quickly recolonize all of our attempts to disturb the vegetation with herbicide. So let's first focus on the graph in the upper left. So that's sown native forbs, the key monarch habitat. We can see that while one herbicide application did increase cover of sown forbs, it was not by a lot. Um, After 3 years, cover was still below 5%, but with 2 herbicide applications, there's 4 times as much cover. Still, we did max out at about 12% cover, which that's not that much. Then let's take a look at the lower right graph to see how cool season grasses responded. So perennial weeds, which in this study was primarily non-native cool season grass species, saw huge reductions in the first year after herbicide, even with a single spray. Twice sprayed plots looked like cool season grasses were practically gone. Um, but by the second and third year, cover was not really any different in controls compared to single spray plots. And even in the twice sprayed plots, cool season grass cover was still almost 60%. So, taking a look at milkweed stems, our sampling approach was not quite enough to deal with the variation in establishment. So, we can't come to great statistical conclusions about site prep. But one thing is pretty clear from our data is that just seeding milkweed into established vegetation does not necessarily lead to established milkweed stems. Milkweed's only established with some herbicide site. Okay, now we're going to look at high value nectar plants. So these are species either USDA has identified as being kind of primary monarch habitat plants or are species that have published accounts of monarchs using them. Overall, they have a similar story. High value nectar plants really only established in the twice sprayed plots. Um, Sort of an interesting story with clover, which came in from the seed bank in the once sprayed plots. So that made a big contribution in the first and the second year, but then kind of disappeared by the third. And it was primarily the native forbs that persisted across time. So here's a visualization of this data. So on the left is a no herbicide plot that was planted with a diverse monarch habitat seed mix, and then the twice sprayed plots are on the right. So we can actually see one lone yellow coneflower in the sea of brome in the unsprayed plot. Um, but there are actually some flora resources available in those twice sprayed plots, even though there are considerable amounts of cool season grass. So to sum this up, intense site preparation is required to enhance monarch habitat and grass stands. We found that seeded species establish best with 2 times applied herbicide. Milkweed established with any herbicide frequency. High value nectar plants are establishing highest when we're spraying twice. And grass cover recolonizes quite rapidly after disturbance. So, some takeaways from this study. While we did get cool season sort of native cool season mixed stands with 2 applications of herbicide, that said, we will likely need to be at least one more additional application or perhaps different timing if we're trying to convert to a fully native dominated stand. It's kind of unclear how long this monarch habitat is going to persist in that mixed context, but we do know that well-managed native dominated prairie restorations do produce nectar plants long term. Um, the other thing we found, milkweed establishes only with site prep. A bit unclear whether one or two herbicide applications are any better than each other for getting more milkweeds, but it is clear that simply seeding into established vegetation does not lead to much established monarch habitat. And then finally, we need more research to understand how to improve these mixed stands. Um, for example, grass selective herbicides might help favor milkweed and nectar plants. And we also need to figure out how much higher herbicide frequency needs to be to convert these introduced stands to native stands, or also if there's improved outcomes with different timing for site prep, which is what NRCS recommends. Okay, so after looking at these three studies, let's revisit or these two studies, let's revisit our initial questions. First, we wanted to know how much monarch habitat does typical CERP currently support? Well, we found that at least for the prairie like CP25 plantings provides 3 to 4 times more monarch habitat than initially assumed. Next, we wanted to know if augmenting that existing CRP was warranted. Yes, we found that most CRP was still grass dominated, which suggests there's room to establish more nectar plants and milkweeds. And then finally, we wanted to know how well interseeding works. This enhancement can work, but it does require high inputs and some significant time commitments for getting site prep right. So what does all this mean for monarch conservation? I think we can distill our findings down to some key points here. Most importantly, I think our work shows that folks who own or manage CRP, again, they can potentially make some really big contributions to monarch recovery. Now, to ensure effective recovery efforts in CRP, first thing we're going to need to do is identify the high quality acres and the low quality acres. In general, CRP practice will tell you a lot, like CP1 or CP2. Those are grass practices that can pretty safely be considered low quality, while CP42 can usually be considered high quality. But there are always exceptions, and this means that NRCS staff doing site checks or landowners visiting their own sites should do what they can to learn how to identify important monarch plants. Certainly the common species of milkweeds, but also fall nectar plants like goldenrods and asters, and also doing the assessments, going out to visit during the early fall when monarchs really need those nectar plants for migration. So if you can identify lots of milkweed and monarch nectar plants on a site already, you could probably use those resources for sites that really do need enhancement. And then, it's also important to prepare for enhancing the low quality acres ahead of time. It's not going to work for folks to make a decision, once it gets warm, to go plant some monarch habitat in that old brome field and expect results just by getting seeds in the ground. We have to help landowners and managers understand the importance of site prep and that it does take time as well as seed and herbicide. In our study today, we needed over a month for site prep, and probably even better than that, you'd have herbicide in the fall and spring before planting, which is what NRCS suggests for cool season grassland conversions. So with that, I want to thank a lot of people, including my collaborators and funders. And at this point, I will go ahead and let Matt take over, or I'll help Matt advance through some final slides here. So thanks everybody for attending, and appreciate the time.
All right, thanks, Justin. That was great, and we got lots of questions in here. So I'll get through these last couple slides quickly. If you watch this webinar live and want to earn a CCA Certified Crop Advisor CEU, send Elena Whitaker alenaw@iastate.edu. Send Elena an email by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, alenaw@iastate.edu. The next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we would greatly appreciate that. Only one response is needed for 2025 webinars. You can scan the QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. And next slide should be okay. Dr. Aaron Day, Associate Professor of Vadozone Science at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, is going to talk about from ruts to roots, strategies to protect and rebuild compacted soils. And then the last one is probably a plug for this webinar, and all previous webinars are on the Iowa Learning Farms webinar archives site. You can go to iowalearningfarms.org/webinars, or we have an Iowa Learning Farms webinars YouTube page. So either one of those should work. Okay, there were a couple questions in here about the last study you described about kind of when were the two herbicide applications done, and kind of a little bit more about the management for that study?
Sure. So what we did, we did one application essentially as soon as it was reasonable. So when things started growing, so that would have been the first week of May was our first application. We used the recommended high end of the recommended rates for brome on the label, as far as what amounts we used. And then we waited for 3 weeks for things to regrow. And so we did our second application at the end of May, so the last week of May. And then we seeded the following week or within a couple days. So that was the approach we took. Mm-hmm. We'll say that that was in a lot of ways that was a bit of a compromise for time. Now we did want to do a second treatment looking at timing. So NRCS tends to recommend a application of glyphosate, in September or October, okay, and then second application in May. So that was something that we did not get to look at, but it's another. While we're talking about things that are good for that we our typical approaches, that's one that's also out there.
Second, I'm going to get up here too. There were a few questions about kind of ways to set the grasses back, whether mowing would help, burning would help set some of those grasses back.
Yeah, so other alternatives to herbicide. So if we look at kind of the established literature out there, there is potential for really high intensity or high frequency mowing for something that you could do to disturb grasses. But that's been done in tallgrass prairies, which are warm season grasses. So something like that could be used to potentially get seedlings established in a warm season grassland like a CP2. But CP1s are really tough because the introduced grasses, introduced cool season grasses are sod forming, so mowing tends to not be as effective. And burning is another option, but we're talking about time frames of like a decade of annual burning to really weaken the grasses to a significant amount. And so it's doable, but I think on the time frame that most people are expecting to do their enhancement, um, it's definitely um, a challenge for a lot of people.
Okay. There was a question in here about the importance of maintaining a diverse prairie. This individual manages a 30-acre reconstructed prairie, and they're concerned it could be taken over by common milkweed if they were not vigilant.
Mm. I've not ever heard of that occurring. So typically, common milkweed is once you get it into a diverse setting with um, forbs and grasses, um, its abundance typically stays about the same,
Okay.
or even it's got a yeah. If you look at those data that I shared really early on, thinking about the tallgrass prairie remnants.
Yeah.
For example, that's not the main species that you find in a tallgrass prairie remnant. Common milkweed is certainly there. It's common, but it's not the dominant species. So that's one thing I don't think you don't think you have to worry about that.
Okay. Here's a kind of one that goes at the roadside vegetation question, I think. So this individual said utilizing CRP, they believe is a great idea, but what about the ditches all over Iowa? Their biggest concern is the county's mowing these before the recommended dates. Last year it was late May, early June, and the year before it was June 1st. They think there are at least 2 generations lost due to milkweed being mowed down in these areas.
Yeah,
Then they mowed in September last year, and there were caterpillars and chrysalis in those areas.
yeah. So first thing would be find out if your county has a IRM program, Iowa Roadside Management Program. So um, that is one way that you can kind of get in touch with folks who are managing roadsides. Um, so if there's a roadside manager, they are quite interested in maintaining, diverse native plantings, and they could probably try to, you know, get in, get the right timing with mowing if possible. So check to see if you've got an IRM program in your county. Get in touch with the roadside manager. If you don't have a IRM program in your county, you could contact Christine Nemec at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. She's the coordinator here, um, and she can help get you some information if you're interested in trying to get a program up and going.
Okay, great. Um, this person indicated native thistles seem to be an important nectar plant for fall migrating monarchs. Oh gosh darn, somebody when why I guess why is that seed not included in restoration mixes?
Yeah, so an interesting question, a good
Okay,
question, because as you can see here on the screen, this is a field thistle or pasture
yeah,
thistle that's native and is in the remnant, and monarchs love them, and they're also really common in CRP as well. They are also so this gets into sort of noxious weed law, and it's even more complicated because it's not something you have to treat anymore. So if you have native thistle on your land, is you're not legally required to get rid of it. It's not a, I believe it's a class primary noxious weed. I forget, but IDALS now has kind of jurisdiction over that. So check the IDALS website for sure. But our native thistles are no longer something that you're compelled to get rid of. When it comes to seed, that's a different question, and I'm honestly not entirely sure how Iowa seed law works with Cirsium because it's the whole genus was kind of identified on the noxious weed list,
oh,
so
okay,
you can't sell noxious weeds. But I'm also not a seed law expert, so you'd have to consult someone who is. So if I were to give you the best answer I could, it revolves around the historical
Yeah.
um, challenges with noxious weeds.
Okay. There was a question in here what effect the ongoing drought might have on monarchs, especially in west central Iowa. And I might expand that if kind of how some of these species, milkweed species, for example, might respond to drought.
Yeah, so I don't know the biology of the
Okay.
milkweeds super well, but in general, um, forbs tend to, you know, drought needs to be tremendously strong if it's going to kill plants, but it's definitely pretty common for forbs to sort of grow smaller, um, flower shorter periods of time, set less seed. So all those things are not great for monarchs. So I think drought typically is certainly not a positive thing for milkweeds and monarch habitat. So, but I couldn't give you any
Yeah.
sort of
Okay.
specific expectations about how it, um, what the overall
Yeah.
magnitude to
Okay.
monarch populations would be.
Okay. So as we start thinking about, we're kind of in February, I guess now, and if somebody were thinking about doing something this fall into existing CRP or perhaps starting as early as this fall, can you give what you think kind of would be your recommendations for kind of planning that to enhance the monarch habitat?
Yeah, so sort of an ideal situation. We're looking at doing your monarch enhancement, next or sort of this fall, this dormant
Mhm.
season. When we say fall, we typically mean November to
Okay.
January. So, um, yeah, I think the ideal situation, if you've got the time and the resources, would be to do one initial spray out using glyphosate of the perennial vegetation you're trying to convert in May or around thereabouts,
Okay.
um, and then a secondary application in the fall.
Okay.
And that would be one approach to do it.
Okay.
The other would be you could also try to integrate a third application in the middle of the summer,
Okay.
though at least in my experience, that tends to the depending on the year, of course. If it's wet, then it would make sense to do a third one in July or so,
Okay.
June or July, with regrowth. But the idea is to um, make applications throughout the growing season so that you have a very much a blank slate when you're going into the fall. So, and then you consider doing your seeding in November, the dormant season.
Okay.
And then you'd want to think about the next year and thinking about a regime to do mowing. So mowing probably every month is always a good way to get prairies established
Okay.
and native plants. So
Okay.
so that would probably be what that transition from this year to the next would look like.
Okay. Would mid-contract management be a good time to establish?
Yeah, so that is a great question,
Okay.
and one thing I wish I could have had more time to share with you because we
Okay.
did a study on that as well.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
so, yeah,
Maybe
so
we
what we
need to
did,
get you back to talk about that one, Justin,
yeah, that would
Yeah,
be
yeah.
fun. Well, real quickly, I'll share.
Yeah.
So, we looked at grass selective herbicide in a variety of different prairie plantings that are about 6 years old, and what we found was that um, basically gave a temporary boost to native forbs. So it is um, it's a way to have a small effect or a small positive benefit. But if you're going to be expecting to really, have a long-term enhance, if you're expecting to seed, I think mid contract management might not be the best time to do that because of this, this what we found in this other study that it really takes a kind of reset to get
Okay.
a lot of new plants established. So uh, that would be my answer
Okay.
on that one.
Okay. I think that kind of in the interest of time, we'll stop there. But I think we got a lot of the questions answered, and I think you've hopefully folks that are on will find out that the Tallgrass Prairie Center is a great resource, and if you haven't, take a look at all of the great resources they have on their website. Really important, I think, for us as we've as there's been more prairie establishment on the landscape, that we have an entity such as Tallgrass Prairie Center here in Iowa. Again, if somebody needs a CCA CEU, please email Alena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today, the name you entered to watch the webinar and your CCA number. And then please consider tuning in next week to hear Aaron Day talk about compacted soils. With that, Justin, I'll give you the last word.
Well, yeah, thanks again for having me. And yeah, I'd encourage folks to check out our website, and especially sounds like there are a lot of questions we didn't get to. So have a take a look at our report on this topic on the publications on our research page.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Justin. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.